All right, it says it's starting to record. Okay, it's recording. Yes. Okay, this is Brent Rains for Alternate Perceptions again. It is now Tuesday morning, October the 25th, and I'm here in my desk at at my a table actually in Waynesboro, Tennessee, and I'm once again talking with Mr. Peter Jordan up there in New Jersey, and we've already been talking for about an hour, and it's been hard to just break away from interesting chit chat we had going on between us. But we decided that we really need to get the show on the road, so here we go. I assume that all the viewers have listened to part one. Now we're going to continue on because we had so much to talk about, and we had gone, I think, over an hour and a half the last time. So anyway, I welcome Peter to all of this another interview, and I've enjoyed
Great to
this.
be here again.
You had such so much a journey, a fascinating journey into the field, the complex and controversial and confusing field of ufology, or as Jim Mosley called it, ufology, and he certainly did a lot of fooling around with it. But let's I guess let's continue on. You talked about the Long Valley events, the all the strange phenomena, this the ghost lighting. You just mentioned about how they I guess the group you're involved with, ghost light, kind of thought of it as a plasma, and it was curious that sometimes you could see it from one viewpoint, but not another. Someone would report from another location they couldn't see what you were seeing. Was that with the naked eye, or was that with like infrared or?
No, usually with the naked eye. With the naked eye, although they did use infrared, and the group was Vestigia, and I think I might have mentioned this the last time. Vestigia was sort of an outgrowth of another group called Situ, the Society for the Investigation of Things Unexplained, which was uh, run by Ivan Sanderson, the late
Mm-hmm.
great Ivan Sanderson,
Oh
and
yeah.
Sabrina, uh, his wife. And they were located up in Blairstown, not far from Hackettstown, same kind of area in Warren County in the northwestern part of the state, where a lot of these strange events have always seemed to congregate. There's always been a lot up there. Um, Maybe because of the remoteness. Not so much now, it's not as remote because it's more built up, it's more industrialized, a lot more construction, residential homes, and so forth and so on. But back in the day, especially in the 70s, up until like 1980 or so, there were vast areas up there where you could get lost, and it was a perfect place, a perfect breeding ground for high strangeness. Let me just put it
Mm-hmm.
that way. So so we would have Bigfoot sightings and strange sightings of pterodactyl-like creatures, winged weirdies, as John Keel referred to them, uh, men in black cases, a lot of hauntings, um, ghosts and poltergeist cases, and those were the types of things that at that particular time that I was especially keen on, and that I was investigating for the Psychical Research Foundation run by William Roll, um, who passed, I think, wow, I think you and I are about the only people that are left at this point. I always feel like every time I'm talking about somebody, I go, wow, that person's gone, and these are
Mm-hmm.
some of the
Yeah.
great researchers of the day, including Ivan Sanderson, that are gone. But in any event, Vestigia started Bob Jones, whose specialty was Bigfoot. He was a colleague of John Green and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
those others. And he was more of a not more of a, he was definitely a materialist as far as it came to Bigfoot. This was a flesh and blood creature. We just hadn't spent enough time or money or resources in order to be able to flesh it out. He was convinced that eventually, just like John Green and some of the others, we would find it. We would get the bones of some of these creatures. We would have the
Mm-hmm.
DNA. We would have so forth and so on. I, from day one, was convinced, I had read quite a bit on it, that that was never going to happen. I mean, I could still be wrong. There are, I mean, Lauren Coleman makes a good point about a lot of animals, a lot of creatures that have yet not, been placed in the history books that haven't been discovered, that maybe in time will be discovered. Could be. Um, Bigfoot, I don't know. Boy, you talk about elusiveness. I mean, that is the definition of elusive. Okay, so anyway, so Vestigia gets formed. Bob Jones is running the group that handles Bigfoot sightings and so forth. I was not particularly interested in going on those kinds of journeys. So we were broken up into different groups, subsets, okay, which was nice. So we had, people interested in Bigfoot that would go with Bob into the field, and they would report. And we had a newsletter at the time. So we would report what had happened, if there was evidence, plaster casts that had been taken, if there were hair samples, so forth and so on. Everything was very, as I said, very reductionist and materialistic. And at the time, given my background, that appealed enormously, to be able to have something where we have data and where we're in control of the data. We don't have to rely on another organization or someone saying, oh, I don't know what happened to that report. We filed it with MUFON and now we can't find it, ran into a black hole, so forth. This way, we know what we're doing, we have it, and we're in control. And also at the time, we just felt we didn't want to be bothered with a lot of people that were just interested in thrill seeking, going on jaunts and, oh, I want to go to a haunted house and so forth. Sort of like what you have now, is the very thing we were working very, very diligently to try to avoid. And Situ was like that. So very much we were kind of a shadow group of that, attempting to do that type of thing. And for a long time, it worked very well. And then a group formed to study something that was legendary in the area. It was the Mystery Light of Long Valley, New Jersey. Now, the Mystery Light, which I had seen once or twice while driving on Route 80 up in that particular area. I didn't know what it was at the time, back in the 70s. When I got involved in Vestigia, I learned that probably what I had seen was this orange ball of light that would often appear, usually over this unused portion of railroad track, that Conrail. It was disused, and it was often seen swinging in a pendulum-like fashion, and it had given rise to the legend of the Hooker Man. And the Hooker Man is a story or a meme that you'll find in many, many different folkloric and mythic tales. And it usually involves somebody, some hapless creature, some guy who's a conductor who's operating the track, and he dies, and he has his arm severed at the wrist, and now he's forced to wear a prosthesis from which he dangles his lantern as he moves up and down the track. Why a lantern, you say? Well, if you ever think of the light from a lantern, the way it flickers. So the way the ball of light would be seen would be, there would be this, outer core of it that would be sort of whitish, but in the center of it was this, I want to say like an orange, red nucleus, and it would flicker sometimes, come in and out of that particular center like that. And it would move in this pendulum-like fashion, and it would move up and down the tracks like this. And it was appearing for years and years and years. And there were all kinds of newspaper articles on it. And of course, most people were convinced that this was the spirit of the Hooker Man in that area. So our group felt, wow, this is the perfect opportunity for us to study something that is repeatable almost on demand. Even if you go down to, let's say, the Brown Mountain Lights, North Carolina, or elsewhere, the Mako Lights, or some of these areas, you can't always depend on the phenomenon occurring when you want it to occur. Sometimes it'll occur spontaneously. When you're filming it, nothing happens, walk away, and things start happening. But in this particular case, it seemed to be happening constantly, almost on a regular basis. So our group, this particular group that was studying it, were comprised of, we had physicists, we had mostly electronic specialists, chemists, all these scientists that were involved in this. And a lot of them were like the typical nerds that you meet in life, you know, that they tinker in their basement and they can build anything. Well, that's what they did. They just build magnetometers. They built all these devices. Um, and then they built this incredible, it took them a while to get this, but it was um, kind of like a go-kart. I think part of it was a go-kart with wheels. They put it on the tracks and they had a remote control. They could actually have it move and had cameras on it. And it had methane gas sniffers. It had all this electronic
Wow.
gear on it. I mean, you know, you got to think about this. This is back, and nobody really had a tremendous amount of money. Nobody was wealthy. We weren't funded by anybody. And this was stuff they just built on their own. Well, this got a lot of attention. I can't even tell you how many people wanted to come up there and watch. And so uh, it was in all the newspapers. But here, the most amazing thing was that we had multiple photos, probably 50 to 100 more photos that were taken of these objects at various times. And sometimes it was large, sometimes it was small, sometimes there were two or three of them. You know, they would sort of pull away from one and then move into the center of it. And I remember thinking back to when I had read a wonderful book by Vincent Gaddis
Hmm.
called Mysterious Lights and Fires. One of the greatest books written about that. So mysterious. But he talks in there, somebody in there, or he talks about plasma, and that plasma, the fourth state of matter, always seems to operate as if there's an intelligence in back of it. Now, of course, scientists, many scientists, including plasma physicists, believe that that's a misperception of what is really going on. What we noticed was, for example, if you stood on the tracks and you approached the light, it would move away as if it seemed to sense your presence. Um, so it was believed that there was a polarization going on, that this particular pole is different than this pole, like the two parts of a magnet, two sides of a magnet, and so they repel one another. So that was the explanation given for why it's behaving the way it is. It's but to people that had experienced it, that thought it was a living or thought it was a discarnate spirit, they said no, the creature, the person, the entity is trying to avoid you when you approach it. That's why you can't get close to it. So I'm just laying that out there.
So
So
your body's energy field would kind of repel the
repels
plasma.
whatever the polarity was.
Hmm.
And they would go into great detail about it. You know, some of it was beyond me, it was mathematical. They were also working with, I forget his name, but he was at Columbia University, uh, uh, and they had a way of detecting seismic activity in a location. So I forgot exactly how they made this connection, but this was one of the things they were working. Dr. Finkelstein, I think his name was, he was a plasma physicist, and he was very intrigued by this. Although he had a different theory, it was called triboluminescence. You know, so he had his own theory about what makes spook lights or mystery lights appear. Our group came up with the idea that this is a form of piezoelectricity, because when we looked underneath the railroad track, we found that it was a huge bed of quartz crystals. Quartz crystals, as we all know, especially during times of pre-earthquake activity, produce thousands of volts per meter. And so this then gets ionized into air. It was speculated there were these iron rails here that when this energy builds up, that acts as a conduit for it. The reason it's moving up and down the tracks is because it's following that fault. There's a fault line there that extends all the way up to Peapack, New York. Okay. Um, and this was the other thing too, very early on that I noticed was, and this is not the first time it's been noticed. I'm saying it's the first time I actually noticed it based on research I was doing in a particular area, which was the association with seismic forces, earth stress, okay,
Hmm.
and earth energy. Um, and it really brought it home because that seemed to make perfect sense to me that this, at least this particular case, this mystery light, this spook light, not to say all spook lights were like this, but that this one really was based or derived from this piezoelectric effect that was happening. And again, it wasn't just the fact that we were able to have a photograph. What you would actually see on some of the infrared photos, which I still have, is you would see this tremendous energy building up on the railroad track. It looks like a phosphorescence going through the tracks like this, and there's the light right above it as it's moving. And then the methane gas sniffer would start going off because the methane gas is bled off during earthquakes. So what we realized was, just before there would be local seismic activity in the area and in some of these neighborhoods where I was investigating poltergeists and hauntings, this energy would be built in this way. So in a way, this was a great introduction for me firsthand into how energy can be created, and then through some sort of conduit, whether it's water, right, or iron ore, right, can actually focalize that energy. In other words, give it a focus. So that's what always made me curious about the connection between what's above and what's below. Okay.
Wow. Yeah, and you could actually visually see the tracks
I'm
glowing in
going
that same
to,
area.
I can't do it here, unfortunately, or share it, but I'm going to look these. I think I still have them on slides. You remember those slides? Oh,
Yes,
God almighty.
I
And
still
I
got a
don't have a
few of those.
scanner. I might have to just send you the slide. But anyway, I have a series of slides, but the one in particular is the one that shows you at the very moment that all of these devices were going, because they had meters on them and they had alarms that would go off when these energies would be. So all this happens simultaneously. That's how we know it is connected. And then the ball would be seen and it would seen on, but sometimes again, with the naked eye, not seen, or it would go out and then it would be seen. You know, it's very similar to what we have in a lot of the haunting cases, where something you see visually or somebody sees visually doesn't appear on film, or things appear on film that you're not seeing visually.
So it goes back to the spectrum and what.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. It goes all the way back to that. So in any way, in any event, this became the working hypothesis and the theory about it. So over time, what happened? This was known as a lover's lane. This was that's how a lot of these sightings occurred, by the way, because kids would be in the car in the middle of an amorous embrace in the back there, and this light would appear. And then sometimes it would actually come flying at them through the windshield. They would hear a sizzling or a popping noise, and then it would exit through the rear. And they would just freak out and then pull out there and believe that this was the hooker man coming after them because he's upset that they're, you know, making love in
Wow.
the car or whatever. So that's how a lot of the early stories were. So despite the fact that we were out there doing all of these rigorous studies and collecting this data, still so many of the local people, they would come to our meetings. We would have these big meetings, and sometimes we would have as many as like 300 people showing up. John Keel used to come to some of our meetings. It was a great time. Bert Schwarz was like an advisor. He would work with me on some of the cases I was involved. He was interested in uh,
Hmm.
the UFO case, not the UFO case, but the haunting case, the poltergeist cases. So he would associate with us. So we had this group of people. Michael Persinger, you might know that name.
Oh
Uh,
yes.
okay, he was one of our associates. This is before he came up with the idea of piezoelectricity creating spook lights, by the way.
Of
That
course.
that created a lot of anger in our group because we were one of the first groups, and probably one of the only groups that I know of, that studied a particular formation of the mystery light in a specific area for more than a year with this kind of equipment, and was able to get the kind of results that we got. Okay. So in fact, Bob Jones, who worked for IBM, decided to make a proposal to them uh, to fund our group to study this further as a possible means of predicting earthquakes based on mystery lights, or the formation of mystery lights. And we were very close to getting that approved. But then there were some people apparently on their committee or whatever that decided it was just, and I think part of that had to do with the fact because also it was at that point that our group had started venturing off into other areas that they thought was disrespect, disingenuous or just, uh, not respectable. Um, so as long as we just stayed with something materialistic like this, that we could prove something, and it might have some sort of application in the study of earthquakes, and it was fine. But because of this, they passed. But over time, what happened was the light continued to appear. Right, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, there were pressures being applied by the police and others because there were too many people going to the area. So they asked Conrail to please come in and to remove the railroad tracks. Now, I always found that to be really strange because our theory was without the railroad tracks, we probably wouldn't have a light. But we had no way to test that because we couldn't go in and say, hey, Conrail, do you mind if we just rip the tracks out? We want to test something. Because then we were also afraid that we would never be able to see the light again or study it, right?
Hmm.
But that decision was made for us for other reasons, being that they didn't want this track there. They wanted to plow it over and so forth and so on. So they removed the track and the light completely disappeared and has never been seen since.
Well, I have a story I think will interest you. I periodically join some friends down here in Cloverdale, Alabama,
Hmm.
and that's about 35 miles from where I live here in Tennessee.
Okay.
And I've known Wyatt Cox and Greg Keaton since the 70s, and they've been investigating this local spook light or earth light, whatever title you want to give it, for a
Okay.
number of years. And it used to appear apparently quite regularly. And they, anyway, it's still occasionally seen, but apparently sometimes it's seen more than other times. I've been down there probably a little over a dozen times. I've seen a couple of lights that were a little odd, but I keep wanting to see one up close. Anyway, they've taken I think over 100 photographs over the
Hmm.
years, and there was one particular night. Now they were they had put all their gear up and they were fixing to go home, and this light appeared over a railroad track nearby, and it just was hovering there. And they said that then a train come along, and as soon as the train got under the light was following the train. It was like in sync with the train.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, they didn't have
That's
their
fascinating. Wow.
camera their
That's very
camera gear.
interesting. Yeah.
But the conversation we just had, of course, and that was always one of the most interesting stories about the light was the time it appeared over the tracks. Now, there's other times, because many times it's not over the railroad tracks, but on that particular occasion, it looked like it was low over the railroad track, and as soon as this train came by, it was like it magnetically locked onto it and was pulled
Uh-huh.
along the rails by it. So
But
anyway,
what I wanted to say too, yeah, that's very interesting. We were always interested in finding other cases that sort of mirrored ours, but you just pointed to something, which is there are hundreds of different places throughout the country and the world where there are mystery lights that appear, but very often they're not over railroad tracks. They can be over beds of water. They could be virtually anywhere. Also, in a lot of those cases, there doesn't seem to be a strict correlation between seismic energy or faults and the light itself. There can often be an absence of that.
right.
So those correlations don't exist. But the biggest problem for our group was that there was nothing that could shake our team, this particular team, from their belief that in fact not only was this due to piezoelectricity, but that all cases of mystery lights wherever they're being reported are due to that. This was something I thought was a bit of a problem, and there were large numbers of people within the group who started finding that this had led to sort of like a calcified belief. that it was just one-sided, that they were just looking at it from a materialistic point of view. And a lot of these people just were interested in using psychics. They were more interested in just that side of it, the mystical side of it, the science, and not so much interested in the science. So the two started ending up in loggerheads. And to make a long story short, what actually happened after a while was it got pulled asunder until the group just fell apart.
Mm.
And then people just kind of went their own way. This person went here, this went there. I stayed on, but then Bob Jones passed some years ago, and some other people passed, or people moved to other states. And so that part of the group kind of got lost. And I stayed with some of the formerly existing members, and we continue to do research into mostly ghosts, paranormal and ghost phenomena, Gettysburg, and places like that. But the core group just dissolved, and that ended.
Right.
There was another thing Keel used to say to me was, "How long do you think this is going to last?" Because he had seen so many the road of good paved with good intentions, especially in this field where you see a group and you say, "This is great. I can't wait to see what they produce." And the next thing you hear, there's infighting, and then it dissolves, and that's the end of it. Or people are suing one another. It gets worse and worse. And I said, well, I hope we can. And Keel thought our group, he says, you guys are doing some great work. You're doing great work. Because you
Yeah.
do, and especially me,
Amazing.
he knew I appreciated both sides of it. I'm not somebody who says, oh, let's forget about that kind of thing about science and studying plasma and all that. No, we should do that hand in hand with all the other kinds of pursuits that we do. So that's why I've never been opposed to doing that in combination with using psychics, for example, or sensitives in order to study a particular site, or to get somebody else's opinion, or to use a and that's what our group was working toward, was a kind of a multidisciplinary approach. So within our group at one point, we had like a well-known New Jersey historian. Um, we had, physicists, we had a chemist, we were ready for pretty much anything that had to be
Yeah.
studied. And I learned a lot from just working with all of them. And it was nice because it was a nice blend of skeptics and materialists, but then that they would listen to your point of view or my point of view. I would listen to theirs, and sometimes they were right, and sometimes I didn't think they were right about a particular case or what side of the fence they were coming up on. But I always thought that was just a great way to blend it together. And if you can do that, that's great. Unfortunately, I think with most groups, it becomes sort of just linear, and it's just one thing or something else. It's just not a good balance between people that believe something and people that are skeptical from a scientific point of view, where you actually are looking at things. There were too many times that people would present UFO photos, for example. I remember we ran into this one guy, a man who lived up in New Jersey, North Jersey, and he lived in this old cabin, dusty old cabin, and he claimed that he had taken the most astonishing UFO pictures, and he refused to show us the negatives, but he gave us copies, and when we looked at them, we thought, wow, these are like amazing. They were taken up in North Jersey. And so finally, after some time of talking to him, we got his permission to come and visit him and to actually see the negatives. As I said, this was an extremely dirty place when we got there. Well, he kept these original negatives in this box. So when you opened it, all this dust came up.
Mm.
And so we took the pictures out and we took them with us. He let us have them for like a day or two. And we went back and I pulled out one of the negatives and I said, oh my God, look, there it is. And then I said, it's gone. And I realized what I was looking at were just pieces of dust that had accumulated on all the negatives. So when you held them up and when you took, when you actually had it developed, it looked like a spherical UFO. Some of them looked like, I mean, it was absolutely astonishing that this would produce that. Again, you hear of things like that, But
Yeah.
until you experience it, you don't realize, wow, it's easy to be fooled by some things, you know? And that was one of the things I learned, that, wow, that, you know, and that was the end of that. And we, in the nicest, most gentle way possible, we just told him it was interesting, but we didn't know what to do with it because we didn't have the heart. He was just so, you know, he embraced this as being a reality. Um, and that was it. And there was no changing his mind, just as there was no changing the mind of the people within our group about the spook light or the mystery light possibly being something else in other cases where it seems to be animated and it seems to be not just a ball but something that looks like an actual entity or no, that was an impossibility. How could plasma be doing that, you know? But again, when you look at the crop circles, you know, yes, you know, here we go again with yin and yang. We have, you know, two old guys who come up and say, yeah, we did all of them. We created them out
Yep.
there with that. Okay. They couldn't have done all of them. They weren't that spry even at
Right.
their ages or whatever. So, and then in the very beginning of that phenomenon, I remember some people, and I think Michael Persinger reported this early on in the 1970s. People were seeing some of these in Canada and elsewhere, and what they would actually see is over a hilltop, they would see something forming like wind, and the wind would start sort of um, again creating a focus. Like I don't know how that works or what that is, but it reminded me of the mystery light, where you have energy that's in one form that now is able to sort of formulate itself or put itself into another kind of shape by creating some sort of focus, and by doing that create more energy. I don't know where that extra energy comes from, but putting it into that shape, wherever that comes from, creates that. But what they would notice is this wind, which was slight, would start building up, and then it would move and become almost like a cyclone or like a tornado or a hurricane, but localized in a particular area over the wheat field, right? And they would actually see the blades of grass or whatever moving up toward to this, where this form is, this energy is, and then being pushed down, and then the wind would subside. And when they would go over there's the classic formation of all these things crisscrossed, and you say, wow, that sure looks like plasma. That looks like plasma. Sometimes they would hear like a crackling noise. And I used to think, what's the wind from? Where's that coming from? But then if we go way back in time, of course, we have the fairy rings and so forth and so on. But it was
Mhm.
so interesting to me. But these were not very ornate circles. These were very simple circles. Funny, it's simple in the beginning, but increasingly more complex over time. And then as they become more complex, what increases as well? Skepticism, because we can possibly attribute some sort of natural earth energy to the formation of these, but how in the world could any kind of energy create something as complex as some of these enormous crop circles that we see? And is that just plasma that's doing that, or is there something else that's happening? We don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Excuse me just a moment.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe about half an hour, 45 minutes. Being asked about the timeline here.
Okay. That's fine.
um, yeah. Okay. And like I mentioned earlier to you, Greg Little and Andrew Collins have written Origins of the Gods and Light Quest, and in those books, the plasma theory and the possibility of even intelligence, which is has been explored by some scientists, is out there. And of course, it's hard to introduce that into the UFO field because class said that tried to explain, use plasma things just a natural explanation for the whole UFO phenomenon.
Exactly.
And
Exactly. Well,
it's
it was
kind of
sort of, it's very similar to sort of paralleled what our group, or the people that were doing the spook light research were doing, where they were trying to explain everything in this regard. Because you have to understand, it is an exciting discovery when you do it firsthand and you actually see it, and you're able to correlate it with all of these other types of electronic effects and so forth. So if you have measurements that correlate with it, if you have visual sightings that correlate with it, why wouldn't you think that, oh my gosh, we've made a momentous discovery, and therefore we can solve all the mysteries of the world? And it doesn't just happen in this case, it happens in many other forms of science.
Mm-hmm.
But, my feeling was, this is an important discovery that we made here,
Yeah.
especially the fact that we were handed this wonderful solution to the problem by removing the iron from the railroad tracks, and that the phenomenon just totally vanished. It's amazing to me that that even worked, but that happened. So what that tells me is, in that specific place, that was essential. That was an essential ingredient to the formation of that particular light. That without it, there was no focus for it.
Yeah.
And the lights, of course, make you think it's connected to the light from a train, but that's part of the synchronicity of it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Wow.
so
That's
anyway,
fascinating.
this was very, very interesting to me. It was a great experience. I was saddened that the group, met its demise the way it did. Um, if we had been allowed to continue, I can only imagine what other discoveries we might have made as a group. I think sometimes certain groups, especially if they're small groups and you have different areas of expertise, you can accomplish a lot more. You can also learn a lot more from one another than you can just being of one-minded. You know, being in MUFON was great, or being part of APRA was great, but yeah, I went to some of the conferences. I spoke at some of the conferences. I read all the newsletters. I contributed to them and all. But it was like a lot of people just thinking the same way all the time. It's good to have somebody from the outside. That's
Mm-hmm.
why I always welcome a skeptical point of view. I saw recently, that the Travis Walton case was coming under fire, not just by, somebody involved within it, Mike Rogers, but also by people outside who think that they came up with alternate solutions. I don't just automatically discard that and say, oh, that's garbage. We know that this is a sacred case. It must be. The Betty and Barney Hill case, I was always never completely sure about it. I was never completely sure. I met Betty Hill, wonderful woman. I didn't know Barney, but from everything I know about them, they were two wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that case came down, again, when you say, I wish it had come down a different way, I wish that this had happened first, or there hadn't been so much of a time gap between the time it gets reported and the hypnosis is conducted. That always bothers me, always bothered me. I told you, especially with hypnosis, that's a tough thing to work with. And I know right now there are people that say, well, we use medical hypnosis, which is very different. That's what Dr. Simon used with the Betty and Barney Hill case, versus the kind of hypnosis that Bud Hopkins and others use. What is medical hypnosis? I don't know. I hear this, Kathleen Martin talking about medical hypnosis. I'm fascinated. What is that compared? What are the contrasts between that and just what other people use? Is there really that much of a difference? I don't know. Does it make a difference? I don't know. But I've always had, certain things that I've always had problems with. So I always go back to cases. I'm one of those people that I always like to retread. People say, well, why are you going back over that old case? We have so many other new things. Well, because we really need to understand certain things about cases that we automatically assume are written in stone. The Hills being one of them, the Travis Walton case being one of them. And I don't know. And it's not to say nothing happened. That's a totally different point of view. That's the debunker point of view, saying nothing happened. or they just saw Venus. Um, Again, the misapplication of conventional science is astonishing to me sometimes. You know, certain things don't make any sort of sense. You know, it's not plausible. If you come up with something that sounds plausible, I listen to it and I'll embrace it or at least entertain it. But if you're going to start saying, "Oh, everything is plasma," or everything is a sighting of Venus, I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's that's just
I,
not the way to
I,
go.
well, I met Betty Hill quite a number of times, and in fact, July of 1976,
Hmm.
she invited me over to her mother's house in Kingston, New
Right.
Hampshire, and I got to
Hmm.
spend about 4 days. And we went sky watching and riding around, meeting other people. And I met Kathy Martin's mother, and I learned when I was there that her mother felt that her house was haunted. And I've since been in touch with Kathleen Martin, and she informed me that whereas her mother thought it was a child ghost or something that was haunting the house,
Hmm.
uh, Kath, Kathleen remembers that it was actually began the night that she and her mother felt a UFO landed across the road from the house,
Interesting.
and that they had an abduction. And
Huh.
so this brings in the combination of UFO and psychic, and then I heard of other stories too, in the family of UFOs and phenomena being seen. So I don't know. There's just a lot of things that weren't reported, originally, and you're just kind of taking those and trying to still connect the dots, put it all together. It's a complex
Yeah, and
case.
especially with the hills, because first of all, in that particular time period, and given that particular culture, um, you have this interracially married couple in which Barney himself suffers constant bullying. He's had numerous examples of places where he was frightened a lot. You know,
Hmm.
um, uh, we have somebody who's borderline, to me, borderline paranoid about going into certain neighborhoods, going certain places. I'm not saying he lived like that every moment of the day. I'm just saying that he could be triggered into believing that if he was in a place where he thought there was a threat or something of that sort. He was a very different personality than Betty. Betty Hill was completely different. Betty Hill was always open to the idea of alien visitation, extraterrestrials, had always, from what I know, was always expressing the thought that she would love something like that to happen to her. Barney never said such a thing. She did. Um, so when we go back to that, um, we say to ourselves, okay, what was left out of the John Fuller book? Probably a lot of things that probably we don't need to know that probably are personal. But those personal things that are in there could be things that could give us some sort of insight. And it could, to a large extent, sort of dissuade us from believing, as did Benjamin Simon, that there might have been something seen in the sky, but then a fantasy system was created around it based on Betty Hill's dreams, which had been conveyed to Barney. So I've always wondered about that particular aspect of it, and I would have loved to have seen or heard more about what was really going on with the Hills during the trip, other than stopping at a diner, going here. Um, what was really going on? Now,
Yeah,
interestingly,
yeah.
my conversations with John Keel about the Hill case came about because in one of Keel's books, I believe it was Disneyland of the Gods, he writes that the Benny and Barney Hill case was the biggest, and I think I'm quoting this correctly, the biggest non-UFO event in history. And I was surprised at that. And I asked Keel, I said, what did you mean when you wrote the biggest non-UFO event in history? Were you just jealous because John Fuller had a big sale and he laughed at that? He goes, no. He goes, I don't think, he goes, what you don't know and what a lot of people don't know is at the time before the book was written, the Hills had placed the entire collection of Benjamin Simon's recording tapes of the hypnosis sessions, all of them, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I was rather surprised at that. I said, why would they allow that to happen? He goes, well, they were there and you couldn't take the tapes out, of course. It was reel to reel, but you could go down and you could listen to them. I went down there every single day, he said, for an entire week and listened to all of the tapes. He said there must have been, he goes, over 120 hours worth of tapes. He said, you would have been very, because he knew I was into psychology, he said, you would have been very impressed with how bad and how troubled that marriage was. Now, again, I have no proof of this. I don't think he was making this up. And he said, it was all based on Betty Hill's recollections and on her dreams, which had been placed together. And Barney was having a lot of problems during the trip with places he was going to, where he felt threatened, where he felt he was going to be attacked. This is what I always wondered about. And I thought, this is fascinating. Will we ever know this? No. Would Kathleen Marden, even if she knew this, ever admit to such a thing? Is this something that people deserve to see? Not necessarily, because it's private. I get that. But those comments from Keel made me seriously question what was going on. I'm surprised nobody else ever discussed this with him. He said I was the first person to ask this question.
Well, I know that Keel did work at the Library of Congress in D.C. So.
Oh, I didn't know he worked there. Oh,
he
that
did.
would explain. That would explain how he knew this, because all he said was they had him stored there at the Library of Congress, and he said, and then once they decided this book was being written by John Fuller, the tapes were removed, and then Fuller was only allowed to have access to certain parts of the tapes. They had been excised.
Well, I know that, yeah, he worked there sometime like 69 to 70.
Okay.
And that's how he actually met Len Cateau, who produced the 400-page bibliography on UFO literature, and how a lot of it was things that were about psychic phenomena and things, and the Air Force wanted that to be brought to Condon's attention,
Right.
Edward Condon, to show that this was not something that belonged in the hands of the Air Force. This was more something for
people that study.
parapsychologists.
I kind of remember Keel talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, Len Cateau and Keel actually dated for a few months. And I got wind of this connection when I was interviewing Tim Beckley, and he said, one time we got talking about the bibliography, and he said one time Keel and Len Cateau came together to sit in on my UFO talk up in Ohio, someplace one time.
Wow.
So they got, and you can read exchanges they had, different letters on johnkeel.com that Doug Skinner, has.
That's very interesting. That's
So
very interesting.
So that was something I had no idea of, that that could.
Well, that would also explain the Library of Congress connection, or how Keel E. I didn't know how he knew that they were there, but if he worked there, that would explain how he knew they were there. But I thought those were interesting comments, and of course, there's no way to prove or disprove any of this, because we'll never be given access to these. The other thing I thought was interesting too, I was reading one of the original interviews with Betty Hill. I think it was one of the local newspapers interviewing her not long after she had gone public with it with Barney. And one of the things I thought was interesting that I had never seen before is Betty said that when they saw the object in the sky, that at first Barney thought it was a plane, right? Uh,
Hmm.
Flying along. And Betty looked up and she said to Barney, "That's no plane." And she goes, "Let's see if I can get their attention." And she started waving and telling them to please come down. And I thought, wow, that is really interesting. I had never,
I
ever
didn't know
heard
that.
that. In other words, not only is she not fearful of this, she doesn't believe it's a plane, but she thinks it's some sort of strange object that is being piloted by creatures, obviously, because she is summoning them and waving them back down. I thought, well, isn't that funny that that's nowhere in the book? And Fuller's book doesn't have that in there,
Hmm.
but it was in this interview that she gave, which was an actual very interesting. It goes into her history and a lot about her politics and what she was involved in with Barney as far as civil rights and so forth. But then
Right.
they go into this section of it, and then she reveals that, and I thought, see, that kind of thing bothers me a little bit. I know it shouldn't, but it bothers me, you know, because we always like to think that these two see something and they're absolutely frightened by what they see. And I think he was. And I think he came to become very frightened by what she was saying to him in the car. Um,
And then he went out in the field with the binoculars and
uh-huh.
said he looked at it and could see it was a craft at that point, hovering, I think, and had windows, and there was a being looking back at him, and he became very terrified.
And then if you listen very carefully in the very beginning, again, we get this morphing or transmogrification where it goes from being, um, oh, he's looking at me, he's a German. Um, he says to Simon, he reminds me of a German, like a Nazi. And Benjamin Simon says, no, he isn't. That's what Benjamin Simon says to him when he reports that he thinks it's a Nazi, and then says they're wearing these caps, and he goes, "I think it's an Irishman because the Irish never liked black people, and I always think of Irish people." It's interesting that and I'm not saying this is completely that there wasn't some sort of creature there, but I find it interesting that it goes through these stages, and then during the hypnosis we get such disparate creatures that don't even look like creatures. One with the Jimmy Durante nose, and remember the
Hmm.
doesn't have a wraparound eyes. Then all of a sudden it has a wraparound eyes, and so forth. And of course, that's explained by people who accept this as prima facie evidence by saying, well, what's happening is it's kind of a screen memory, and so they're not seeing it the way it really is, and then it's eventually resolving itself into what it is authentically, which is that of a creature. Yeah, you could take that
Yeah.
point of view, or you could also go the other way. And remember, at that point, Betty had had lots of opportunity of taking these dreams that had crystallized in her mind and converted Barney, who was resistant to the idea of anything alien or so forth, to now believing and accepting. That's even before they go into hypnosis. So all it takes is a small suggestion. And of course, there's almost, Betty was always very dominant. Even when I met her and talked to her, you could tell that she's a very dominant individual, a very smart person, super
Hmm.
intelligent as he was. But he, to me, was always a little bit more placating and subordinate to Betty. I could be wrong, but that's my read about that. You know,
Yeah.
you have to
Um,
understand too. Once you become, once you are as interested as I am in the human mind and in the psyche, it's very hard for me to just pull away and just accept everything that's there. There's too many things here that come. There's so much that comes from our unconscious, and when you're talking about hypnosis, there are things that rise up that you're not aware of, you're not conscious of, that can come. Some of those things happened, and a lot of those things didn't happen. What you're trying to do is to fill in the gaps and to make it a coherent story. You're trying to make a narrative at it so that you understand something. And that happens a lot, I believe. So I
Yeah.
don't know. When people see things sometimes, if you and I were standing there, it's almost like the mystery light, and they said, there's a creature here, there's an alien. Do you see him? We might look at it and say, well, I see a ball of light here. I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. And then we all like to think that, well, whatever this intelligence is, it makes the projection. But, you know, we're giving the intelligence almost too much credit. We're not giving ourselves enough credit. We never give
Yeah.
ourselves enough credit for what we're capable of doing through our imagination.
At
Now,
which
if
point,
you combine our imagination with a force outside of us, wow, then the impossible becomes possible.
yeah, they
But
could, I mean,
how do you separate one from the other? You can't.
yeah, because, Keel said that, they could maybe read us and, as I understand, and kind of take things from our own background and work on it, our belief systems, our expectations, and create a psychic drama from that, and it's something we'd accept and subject ourselves to whatever it is they wanted to do with us,
Well,
I guess.
absolutely. And that's why I think sometimes if you have somebody who's like a fierce skeptic or one of the debunkers, let's say, Philip Klass, Schaefer, all those guys, they claim they never had a single paranormal thing happen to them in their lives, you know? Um, James Oberg, we could go down the list of all of the ones that are part of that pantheon of great
Hmm.
debunkers and skeptics. They've never had an experience. So you say to yourself, well, okay, I understand that. If you've never had an experience, how could you even relate to anyone um, who didn't have one? But if your frame of reference is such that it doesn't even allow for that possibility, right? You've never had it, or it's not part of your schema.
Hmm.
Then, of course, probably even if you were with somebody who's having an experience, you probably wouldn't share in it. Not all the time, but I think more often than not, I have found that to be true. That when
So
I was
really,
in the presence of other skeptics, nothing happened, or debunkers. The Uri Geller effect is a perfect example. Geller goes on Carson, Johnny Carson show with Carl Sagan, and can't get anything to work. He's very frustrated, you know. Might have been with Randy. I might be confusing with who the guest was with them. I think it was might have been Randy one time, and Carson, of course, was a uh, fiercely anti-psychic, anti-paranormal.
I think he was
Essentially,
also a magician himself, wasn't he?
magician and into
Yeah.
astronomy, and he loved Carl Sagan. He loved having him on. So my point is, he goes on, and here's Geller, and Geller can't make anything happen. And he's with Randy, and Randy's able to do it by magic. Again, we just go through these, we're in these scenarios where if it's not part of their DNA, if it's not something that they accept as being possible, then it isn't possible. It's not possible. And so it will never be possible, and they'll never experience it. So the problem is already, you have someone who's not even going to consider this as a possibility. They're already looking for chinks in the armor. They're not even saying, okay, let me look at this completely objectively. No, there's no such thing as objectivity. You have to go, you're going in with some sort, all of us, myself included, you're going in with some sort of preconception about something, or you wouldn't be involved in it. We wouldn't be involved in this study of this if we didn't think there was some remote chance that a portion of these stories, regardless of what they are exactly as they're being reported. We wouldn't be wasting our time, right?
Right. Well, I thanks to Dr. Schwartz, I actually got to interview Kreskin one time, and he
Ah,
told he told a story once of how he was speaking to a skeptics group, and he says, a person who uh, believes very strongly in paranormal phenomena and such will sometimes go overboard, and they'll start to experience things, imagine things that really aren't psychic. And he says, and they were all nodding their heads. And then he says, but by the same token, someone who has closed their mind and is a skeptic may, in fact, turn around and actually you know, not even explore the possibility because they already don't believe it. They've already shut themselves off to it. And at which point everybody's no longer nodding their head. They're like, what? you know, and so you've got to
Mm-hmm.
try to be, you've got to walk that objective pathway where you consider, the possibilities. Otherwise, you may shut yourself off. But
Well, and again, we can go back. That's why I think it's important what I always remind myself is not to just focus on one aspect of it, because sure, I could make a case of the Betty and Barney Hill case based upon what Keel said and my own perceptions of it, that there's no reality to it at all. But on the other hand, I would have to disregard some of the admittedly circumstantial physical evidence of things that something happened. The scuffed shoes that Barney had, right? The tops of his shoes were scuffed. How about the ring that Betty lost? You know about this? She lost a ring during the abduction. And I don't know if it was when they came home uh, after the abduction had taken place that night, or if it was the following day. In the kitchen, they discovered there was like a pile of leaves and debris on the top of the kitchen table, and inside of it was the ring. Okay,
and of course, there's the dress that was stained that's
so you
still
got the
being
dress.
analyzed.
You
Yeah.
have, how about the rings on the back of the trunk, right? The trunk had been popped open, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Remember, she took the compass, put it near them, had those effects. There were other people that saw this too and witnessed it. It wasn't just her and her husband. So when you look at some of that, you say, okay, well, then we have to explain, how did that all happen? Is that just a
Right.
coincidence that, that we have these things happen? Um, I can't explain those things. So until you really understand the entire thing or try to explain, or you can explain all of it, it's really hard. It's very difficult to piece,
Right.
to take one thing out of the other.
And if you're ready, could we now migrate down from Long Island to Highbridge and discuss Howard Menger, another case that
Yeah,
can tear you and pull you in different
boy,
directions?
I'll tell you. So, it's hard to know where to start with that, but let me do this. Let me just talk a little bit about one of the things that really gave me pause with regard to the Menger case, as far as it being completely fraudulent. Okay. Now,
Hmm.
we talked about Dr. Schwarz, and Dr. Schwarz, of course, had done psychiatric interviews with Rose Menger, Howard's first wife. Through her, he learned that there were other associates, friends that lived in the Highbridge area who had also experienced some of their own paranormal and UFO events separately and many times independently of Howard Menger. Many of those same people within that group also were fiercely skeptical of Menger and produced a lot of evidence to me and to Schwarz that in fact he had confabulated, that he and his next wife, Connie Menger, had in fact conspired to produce a lot of fake evidence for these events that never happened. But still, the people within his group had a total belief that the things that they had experienced separate from him had no rational explanation. And so I set out to find that out. Schwarz gave me the names of all these associates. I went and I met them and interviewed all of them, and they were a wonderful group of people. Um, I heard all kinds of stories. I heard stories of things that had happened to them, and I won't go into because it'll take too long. But I've written about it elsewhere, of some of the things that they've experienced, where they could experience together, some of them separately. Um, and these were not people that you would ever think would be. They were absolutely um, opposed to the idea of going public with this, or getting press. They were very quiet about it. And they wanted it kept that way, and I promised to keep it that way. Some of them only wanted pseudonyms used, and this is years after the events had taken place. You would think they wouldn't care, but they still cared about that. So it was clear to me they weren't making things up. They were telling the truth. Um, so we became pretty close. This group and I, we would meet on a semi-weekly basis. I would have my tape recorder. I would record all this stuff. I would make no comments half the time. I wouldn't ask leading questions. I would just let them talk. Eventually, what happened was one within the group, I forget who it was. Um, so this is the end of February of 1978 when this is happening. One of them within the group turns to me and says to me, "You're always asking us questions. What have you experienced?" And I said, "Well, I'll be honest, I've experienced a few things here and there, the paranormal realm, but I really haven't had any big UFO events or anything of this sort personally." "Well, how did you become interested in this?" And then I told them when I was young, what my researches were, Harry Houdini, and then that led to Arthur Conan Doyle, and then I became interested in Kehoe and Frank Edwards, like a lot of us, reading all
Hmm.
those books, and I was always fascinated by it. And they said, "Well, this is the way it used to be for us." He said, "When we used to get together as individually, like if we tried to do things individually, it didn't work. But when we worked as a group, there's really something to the idea of there's power in numbers, you know? And when you're with a group, it's almost like it's contagious. And we all started to experience like a lot of the same things. So I think that's what's going to happen to you now. You're next." And they all cracked up. They thought that was the funniest thing. "You're next." I laughed too. So I don't know if it was the next day or 2 days later, I was in a bookstore, right? Like I always was, whether it was Barnes and Noble or wherever it was, and always in the UFO section, which used to be filled with great UFO books. And I
Yeah.
see there's a book by Bill Barry, The Travis Walton Case, right? Not Travis Walton's book, but Bill Barry, a journalist, right? A little paperback that I still have. That's a collector's item now. So I said, "Oh, this is interesting." And I knew of the Walton case, but I didn't know much about it. So I go home, and that night I go to bed and I read the book. And this is interesting. My thought pattern is interesting.
Hmm.
As I'm reading it, I'm thinking, I don't know. I don't know. I'm thinking about this logically. He's in this car, he's in the truck with Mike and the other guys that are part of his group, uh, you know, uh, and they see this object, they see this beam, and what does he do? He bolts from the truck and runs toward it. And for some reason, that just struck me as being insane. I said, "That's crazy. Who would run towards something like that?" You might study, you're in the safety of this truck, you got, the windows rolled up. Why would you run toward it? And then I thought, so you run toward it only if you're familiar with it. You've seen it before maybe, or you've had a similar experience, or you've always wanted to have that experience. You wanted to be up close and personal. Nobody else is running out of that truck. Why
Mm-mm.
are you doing it? Now, I know this sounds crazy, but
Yeah.
that's the way I think. Like, if I were him, why would I do that? And that gave me pause. I thought, maybe this isn't the way it went down. Maybe it went down differently. I don't know, but this doesn't make sense. So, and then of course, there's the description of him standing in front of it and the beam hits him in his chest and he's throwing back and then he's knocked unconscious. And then Mike slams on the accelerator. At least that's the version there. I've heard different versions now. And then he takes off. They leave their friend behind. And then we know the rest. He disappears for
Hmm.
5 days or whatever.
Right.
So anyway, I read it, go to sleep. Okay. Now I'm living at home at the time. I'm living in Union, New Jersey, which was not a hotbed for UFO activity. This is in the central part of the state. Not a lot going on. No recent UFO reports that I know about. Nothing of that particular sort. So I go to sleep in my bedroom, and my window on my here on the right faces onto a small woods. It's a small wooded area back there. So I fall asleep, and suddenly I'm startled awake by the sound of what I would say is like the sound, it's like a humming or a generator, right?
Hmm.
And when I open my eyes and I hear the sound, it's accompanied by there's a vibration going through my bed. Okay. And I'm thinking, what in God's name is that? Now we had these wooden shutters right on the window. And if you look through, it's dark because it's early in the morning, it's dark outside, but all of a sudden there's a flash bulb like that, right? Like an effect. The light is so bright that it's coming through the slats in this through the window, but I can also make out the veins on the leaves on the trees. I remember remarking to myself, wow, that is some bright light. Now I'm thinking, and then this mechanical sound, which is still going with this vibration, stops. It just stops, there's no light. And now I'm feeling a little unnerved. Starts back up again, same scenario, vibration, sound of a generator, light, flash, brilliant light. And see the leaves in the tree. In fact, I'm studying the leaves. I'm like, where's my camera? Because I had a camera, but it wasn't
Hmm.
near the bed, right? So shuts off. And now this sound of and this beam of light comes through the window, and it's got the same color configuration as the light Travis Walton talked about in the book that I had been reading. So it's this blue, white, and I see it, and it's headed. So my door is open, it goes down the hallway, and I'm like, and it just hangs there. I'm like, that's what a laser looks like. I had never seen a laser beam up close. So I don't know what a laser is. I was amazed by that and
Hmm.
I felt, this is fascinating. I'm not scared yet. I'm just fascinated by this, trying to make sense of it. I don't feel threatened or anything, but it's when you experience it, it's like it's described by a lot of people. It's just a total different reality. So the light's moving like this. So I lean forward, and there's part of me that wants to go to the window and see and I go, I'm not going to the window because look what happened to Travis. He runs to the light. It's part of the same thought process that I had,
Hmm.
that I would never, if this happened to me, I wouldn't go toward the light because I'd get hit and I'd be knocked unconscious and I would no longer be in control. So I'm very careful. I lean forward though, and I look down the hallway and I can see with a beam of light, coherent beam of light, ends up at the wall of my parents' bedroom. Now, here's the thing that frightened me. My mother at the time was sleeping, was the lightest sleeper in the world. My mother, if she heard a bird outside or anything, she would wake up like that, right? I start yelling to my mother. She never stirs. Then I became frightened because I knew, I said, this is where knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I said, she switched off. She switched off. That's the UFO investigator part of me that has heard that so many times and I never knew what
Hmm.
that meant. Now I see what it means, right? So I continue, now I'm really screaming. Okay, nothing. Light stops, extinguishes itself. Again, a repetition of the sound plus the vibration, flash of light, and this is going to sound really strange. I became so scared about this and so frightened that in my mind, I said, I'm not ready for whatever you are. And like that, it was over. I actually thought that this might go into something else, and I did not want to experience it. Frankly, I don't think I could have handled it. We
Yeah.
all like to think, when I'm investigating someone, or I'm listening to their accounts, I can empathize with them, but I'm not frightened. But when I experienced this, I was very frightened by it. Now, I didn't see anything. I didn't see any entities. There was no telepathic communication, but I thought, my God, if I see something, I'm going to flip out. This is absolutely bizarre. So anyway,
Hmm.
the minute was over. I stood up in bed and turned the light on. And there, I had the book there with a pad because I always kept notes. And I wrote down everything that had just happened, right? It's 5 a.m. Here's what happened. I had a small picture that I drew of what it was. And I knew for a fact that I wasn't asleep. I wasn't sleeping. I was wide awake when this particular experience occurred. So the next morning, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited for my mother. She got up like an hour later. She goes to the bathroom. I meet her in the hallway and I said, did you hear anything last night? And she goes, no. Why? She goes, look at you. I was like, I had these pajamas on. I was completely drenched in sweat. And she said, what are you scared about? And I said, you didn't hear anything last night? She goes, no, I would have heard it. You were dreaming. And that was it. And I remember later that morning, I got up the resolve I said, I have to call somebody. I said, this is so bizarre. So I called Bert Schwarz and I figure I'll call Bert, he'll make me feel better, psychiatrist, he'll calm me down. No, not at all. I call him up, I get him on the phone, I tell him what happened. He goes, Peter, that is magnificent. I'm so glad you've had that experiences. I'm sure you're going to have many more now. I go, Bert, that's not what I want to hear. He goes, Peter, and I had told him what the group said. He goes, that often can happen within a group like that. That's excellent. It's almost like the contactee syndrome, you know, and he says, or a medium, within a particular group or whatever. And he goes, you probably have these abilities you don't even know. I said, I'm not interested in pursuing them. He goes, of course you are. Who wouldn't be? He goes, I would love to have that happen. I said, well, good. When they appear, I'm going to send them to you. They're not far away. It'll take them 3 minutes to get them on clear. And
Wow.
I said, and you can analyze them all you want. So anyway, long story short, I go back to the group about a week later. I tell them what happened. And instead of being consoled, they just think it's funny that I'm so scared. They go, we find it funny that we're telling you that we had these experiences and we thought they were fabulous, and you are out here listening to us just tell stories that you don't know whether they're true or not. Finally, you have your own experience and you're so petrified that you pull away from it and you don't even want to continue with it. And I said, absolutely. Who would want to continue with this? This is insane, because I don't know what these things are. I don't know what this force is. I said, for all I know, that was some sort of a government mind control experiment. You know, I don't know. I still to this day don't know. I never had another experience like it. What I do know was it was strictly dependent upon my involvement, my emotional connection to the Menger story and to that group of people that I was involved with at that particular time. So it wasn't just like a one-off where I was going down there, like I did with some other cases, talk to somebody and then leave. I was really like trying to re-inhabit that whole time period with Menger, uh, and trying to figure it out. And I had just stacks and stacks of newspaper articles and things that had happened at the time, you know, Mosley's recollections, Keel, everyone else. So I was like obsessed with it. And I really think that all of that just sort of like came together, but I'll never know exactly what it was about, you know? I'll
Yeah.
never know. But it was one of the strangest things, that I ever experienced.
Now this laser beam type light, was it just instantly on, or was there movement, like you could see it shooting out?
No, instantly. So there would be the sound, and then whatever the sound was, it looked like that sound was causing it uh, to be generated, and then it would just form straight,
Hmm.
straight.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's interesting. I'll just briefly mention that back in 1975, I had spent almost the whole summer traveling around different states, and there was one place I revisited up around Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, near Akron, and
Hmm.
there was a group of people who were many of them like contactee experiences that would meet there at this home of Madeline Teagle, who was a contactee, and she always impressed upon that one of the most interesting people was this Al Roush from Akron, and he could actually produce UFO phenomenon. And she told about how he produced it for her. And so I interviewed him. And he told me about his initial experience back in like 1956. And he's meditating. He's trying to make contact. A beam of light shoots down into his house, which is by this time like semi-transparent or something. And there's all this weird energy. And he goes over, and these two tall beings shoot up with him into this spherical UFO, and they go off to another planet. And on this planet, it's very primitive conditions. Everything's like rocks and things. And he goes to this rock octagonal court, and he's shown how these two being, or this one being, I guess, maybe it was two. Anyway, I've written about it. They could uh, extend their arms, and this bright light would appear, and it would cut this rock in half. And they would, they ask him, "Do you know what you observed?" And he said, "That's what we call God. God is energy." And so he says, "Wow, but what about the Great White Father?" And he says, when he said that, it seemed to make these beings mad, and they put him. Uh, he was in this octagonal court. Maybe that came later, I guess. Yeah, I think they placed him in an octagonal court, and there were these gates, and they would open up, and a lion. He says, an honest to God lion would appear, and they led me to believe. And he had a hard time explaining what he was trying to say on this, and he kept repeating it. But it was like um, that there was nature, and then there was this higher force, and this would keep, you know, they could keep nature from attacking
Oh,
uh,
I see.
us.
Okay.
And so, anyway, as he was explaining, he said he called it the lion test. And he says, you know, and you might experience this yourself sometime. And I didn't think anything of it, but later when I returned to Maine, I had this experience one night of of going to bed. And the next thing I knew, I thought I was going back toward the hallway from the bedroom, and I stopped, and suddenly it was like I knew there was someone behind me holding me back, but I didn't feel anything, but I just had this knowledge in my head, and I kept looking toward the doorway. The hall light was still on. My father was still he was still in the bathroom about to go, you know, making his last minute pit stop before going to bed, and my mom was already in bed in her room, and so um, I just stood there looking at the door. It all seemed perfectly real at the time, and and sensible. But all of a sudden, there were like these hundreds of small balls of light swirling around in the hallway, and they were pulsating. They were white. They were transparent, and
Wow.
like and as they got to the bottom of the door, they seemed to be taking the shape of a small four-legged animal. And and then next thing I knew, I was laying on top of the bed, looking up at the ceiling. And usually, when I crawl into bed, I go straight in. I remember being tired that night, and I would be either laying on my side with a cover over me or laying on my stomach. But here I was, just laying on my back. And uh, and then later, I'm listening to my interview with the guy out there in Ohio, and that part struck me. Where he says, "And you might experience it too." Of course, it was weeks since I had interviewed him, but that was one of the cases that had most intrigued me because other people he could
That's
call
fascinating.
the
Yeah.
objects down. And I always wondered if him saying that might have had something to do with the way that I experienced that vision or out of the body
Mm-hmm.
experience or
Wow.
whatever it was. But because I have no memory of feeling, like I was touching the floor as I walked over it. I just assumed I was at the time. I assumed I was, I